Hello, students. Today we're going to talk about period 4, the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a Protestant religious revival during the early 19th century. The movement itself was focused, much like Romanticism, on the individual, specifically their relationship and connection with God and intuition. It was a clear break from the Enlightenment emphasis on rationality, logic, and focused more on emotional connections and spirituality. It was also defined by its millenarian characteristics, meaning Second Great Awakening movements were often seen as new wave movements in which society and faith would be reborn or Jesus would return for the second time. As such, new denominations or even entire faiths were created, and many of which that would receive a cold reaction from the most Protestant believers. New denominations. Two of the most prominent spiritually driven, less conventional denominations were the Methodist and Baptist. Both focused more on reinvigoration of emotion and spiritual connection with God and were much more accepted by their contemporaries. Both, like most religious movements inspired by the Second Great Awakening, celebrated through music, song, and sometimes dance. Methodists, in particular, did well on the frontier, expanding in the West in high numbers. Baptists remained largely on the East Coast, focusing more on adult life as a Christian and rebirth and adult baptism. Shakers, as they were called, due to their emphasis on wild and loose dancing, were started by founders such as Mother Ann Lee. While the Shaker movement itself would see a large initial following, they were labeled radicals for their views on sex. For example, men and women were segregated, and Shakers were opposed to any form of sexual intercourse, advocating instead celibacy. Another radical group were the Unitarians, who functioned as a rationality and enlightenment based counter to the emotional and spiritual movements. Staying largely in New England, the Unitarians rejected literal scripture, thus earning them the term radicals and resulting in their resistance from mainstream Protestants, and asserted Jesus was not divine but was instead a human model for morality. The last radical movement was the subject to much persecution were the Mormons, funded by initially led by Joseph Smith in 1830. Like the Unitarians, they rejected scripture, but instead of emphasizing rationality and logic, had a more millenarian tone, arguing Jesus had already come to the Americas a second time. Furthermore, Smith asserted the Jews had made their way to the Americas hundreds of years ago, and the ones that remained were Indians who had their skin darkened after Jesus' second coming and had forgotten their history. Smith's movement for autonomy and tax exemption, however, resulted in a state persecution and his eventual killing in 1844 near Illinois. Not wanting to meet the same fate, Brigham Young led the Mormons to contemporary state of Utah to escape persecution where they, along with other inhabitants, were later added as a state. Women's rights. Originating with the Whig movement for morality as well as the abolitionist movement for equality, feminism began to gain traction in the 19th century. While it would be several decades before legal measures would be taken, groups began to meet and codify their views and arguments. Early feminists, known as the first wave feminists, focused largely on political participation, most notably the right to vote. Among these were Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Frederick Douglass. Women and men even organized the first feminist meeting in 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York, and wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, largely based on the Declaration of Independence. Thank you, students, for listening in.